Chapter 3, Part 2 of The Uttermost Farthing. This recording is in the public domain. By MaryAnn. The Uttermost Farthing by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 3, The Housemaid's Followers. Part 2. The surviving burglar stood petrified, stooping over his comrade, with the lantern in one shaking hand and the revolver still grasped in the other. And as he stood he poured out, in a curious whimpering undertone, an unending torrent of incoherent blasphemies, as appeared to be the habit of that type of man when frightened. I stepped silently behind him and looked over his shoulder at the expiring criminal, speculating on what he would do next. At the moment he was paralyzed and imbecile with terror, and I had a strong inclination to dispatch him then and there. But the same odd impulse that I had noticed on the last occasion constrained me to dally with him. Again I was possessed by a strange, savage playfulness like that which impels a cat or a leopard to toy daintily and tenderly with its prey for a while before the final scrunch. We remained thus motionless for more than half a minute in silence broken only by his blasphemous mutterings. Then, quite suddenly, he stood up and began to flash his lantern on the stairs and about the hall, until at length its full light fell on my face, which was within a foot of his own. And at that apparition he uttered a most singular cry, like that of a young goat, and started back. Another moment and he would have raised his pistol arm, but I had foreseen this and was beforehand with him. Even as his hand rose, the concussor struck the outer side of his arm, between the shoulder and the elbow, on the exact spot where the muscular spiral nerve turns round the bone. The effect was most interesting. The sudden nerve stimulus produced an equally sudden contraction of extensors. The forearm straightened with a jerk, the fingers shot out straight, and the released revolver flew clattering along the hall floor. Anatomy has its uses even in a midnight scuffle. The suddenness of my appearance and the promptness of my action paralyzed him completely. He stared at me in abject terror and gibbered inarticulately. Only for a few moments, however. Then he turned and darted toward the street door. But I did not mean to let him escape. In a twinkling I was after him and had him by the collar. He uttered a savage snarl and dropped the lamp on the mat to free his hands. And as the spring switch was released, the light went out, leaving us in total darkness. Now that he was at bay, he struggled furiously, and I could hear him snorting and cursing as he wriggled in my grasp. I had to drop the concussor that I might hold him with both hands, and it was well that I did, for he suddenly got one hand free and struck. It was a vicious blow, and had it not been partly stopped by my elbow, the adventure would have ended very differently, for I felt the point of a knife sweep across my chest, ripping open my pajama jacket and making a quite unpleasant little flesh wound. On this I gripped him round the chest, pinioning both his arms as well as I could, and trying to get possession of the knife, while he made frantic struggles to aim another blow. So, for a while we remained locked in a deadly embrace, swaying to and fro, and each straining for the momentary advantage that would have brought the affair to a finish. The end came unexpectedly. One of us tripped on the edge of the mat, and we both came down with a crash, he underneath and face downwards. As we fell, he uttered a sharp cry and began to struggle in a curious, convulsive fashion. But after a time he grew quieter, and at last lay quite still and silent. At first I took this for a ruse to put me off my guard, and held on more firmly than ever. But presently a characteristic limpness of his limbs suggested a new idea. Gradually and cautiously I relaxed my hold, and, as he still did not move, I felt about on the mat for the lamp, and when I had found it, and pushed over the switch, I threw its light on him. He was perfectly motionless and did not appear to be breathing. I turned him over, and then saw that it was as I had suspected. He had held the knife ready for a second blow when I had pinioned him. He was still grasping it so when we fell, and the point had entered his own chest near the middle line, between the fourth and fifth ribs, and had been driven up to the very haft by the force of the fall. He must have died almost instantaneously. I stood up and listened. The place was as silent as the grave. A remarkably apt comparison, by the way. The pistol shots had apparently not been heard by the police, so there was no fear of interruption from that quarter, and as for the maids, they were very carefully keeping out of harm's way. Still there was a good deal to do, and not so very much time to do it in. It was now getting on for 3 o'clock, and the sun would be up by 4. Daylight would bring the maids down, and everything must be clear before they made their appearance. I wasted no time. One by one I conveyed the bodies to the laboratory and deposited them in the tank, the accommodation of which was barely equal to the occasion. The sudden death of the first man had rather puzzled me, but when I lifted him the explanation was obvious enough. The heavy blow, catching the head obliquely, had dislocated the neck, so the concussor was not such a very harmless implement after all. The slight traces left in transporting the material to the laboratory I obliterated with great care, excepting the last man's knife, which I left on the mat. Then I changed my pyjamas, putting the blood-stained suit to soak in the laboratory, strapped up my wound, put on a dressing-gown, opened the street door and shut it rather noisily, and ascended with a candle to the upper floor. The housemaid's bedroom door was open and the room empty. I tapped at the cook's door and elicited a faint scream. "Who's that?" a shaky voice demanded. "It is I," was my answer. A stupid answer, by the way, but of course they knew my voice. The door opened and the two women appeared, fully dressed but rather dishevelled and both very pale. "Is anything the matter, sir?" the housemaid asked. "Yes," I replied. "I think there has been a burglary. I woke in the night and thought I heard a pistol shot, but, putting it down to a dream, I went to sleep again. Did either of you hear anything?" "I thought I heard a pistol go off, sir," said the cook, "and so did Susan. That's why she came in here." "Ah," said I, "then it was not a dream. Then just now I distinctly heard the street door shut, so I went down and found the gas alight in the dining room and the safe open." "Lor, sir!" exclaimed Susan. "I hope nothing's been took." She spoke exceedingly badly for a good-class housemaid. "That," said I, "is what I wish you to find out. Perhaps you will come down and take a look around. There is no one about now." On this they came down with alacrity, each provided with a candle, all agog, no doubt, to see what success their friends had had. The first trace of the intruders was a large blood stain at the foot of the stairs, at which Susan shied like a horse. There was another stain near the street door, and there was the burglar's knife on the mat, which the cook picked up and then dropped with a faint scream. I examined it and discovered the letters G.B. cut on the handle. "It looks," I remarked, "as if the burglars had quarrelled. However, that is none of our business. Let's see what has happened to the safe." We went into the dining room and the two women looked eagerly at the open safe, but though they both repeated the hope that "nothing had been took," they could hardly conceal their disappointment when they saw that the contents were intact. I examined the roughly made false key without comment, but with a significant glance at them, which I think they understood, and I overhauled a couple of large carpet bags, neither of which contained anything but the outfit of appliances for the raid. "I suppose I ought to communicate with the police," said I, without the slightest intention of doing anything of the kind. "I don't see what good that would do, sir," said Susan. "The men is gone, and nothing hasn't been took. The police would only come in and turn the place upside down and take up your time for nothing." Thus Susan Slodger, with a vivid consciousness of the false key, made exactly the suggestion that I desired. Of course it would never do to have the police in the house again so soon. I affected to be deeply impressed by her sagacity, and in the end decided to "let sleeping dogs lie." Only Susan did not realize how exceedingly soundly they slept. It was necessary for me to visit the osteological dealer in the course of the morning to obtain 3 suitable skeletons as understudies according to my plan. This was quite indispensable. The dealer's receipt and invoice for 3 human skeletons was my passport of safety. But I regretted the necessity, for it was certain that as soon as I was out of the house one of these hussies would run off to make inquiries about her friends, and when it was found that the burglars were missing, there might be trouble. You can never calculate the actions of women. I did not suppose that either of them was capable of breaking into the laboratory, but still, one or both of them might, and if they did, the fat would be in the fire with a vengeance. However, it had to be done, and accordingly I set forth after breakfast with a spring tape and a note of the measurements in my pocket. Fortunately, the dealer had just received a large consignment of skeletons from Germany. Heaven alone knows whence these German exporters obtain their supply. So I had an ample number to select from, and as they ran rather small, I suspect they were mostly Frenchmen, I had no difficulty in matching my specimens, which, as is usual with criminals, were all below the average stature. On my return I found that the housemaid was out, doing some shopping, the cook explained. But she returned shortly, and as soon as I saw her I knew that she had been making kind inquiries. Her manner was most peculiar, and so was the cook's for that matter. They were both profoundly depressed and anxious. They both regarded me with evident dislike and still more evident fear. They mumped about the house, silent and restless. They showed an inconvenient desire to keep me in sight, and yet they hurried out of the rooms at my approach. The housemaid was very much disturbed. When waiting at table she eyed me incessantly, and if I moved suddenly she jumped. Once she dropped a soup tureen merely because I looked at her rather attentively. She was continually missing my wine-glass and pouring the claret onto the tablecloth, and when I tested the edge of a poultry carver, which had become somewhat blunt, she hurried from the room and I saw her watching me through the crack of the door. The arrival of the understudy skeletons from the dealers a couple of days later gave her a terrible shock. I was in the dining-room when they arrived, and through the open door heard what passed, and certainly the incident was not without a humorous side. The carrier came to the front door, and to Susan, who answered his ring, he addressed himself with the familiarity of his class. "Here's 3 cases for your master. Funny 'uns they are, too. He don't happen to be in the resurrection line, I suppose?" "I don't know what you mean," Susan replied sourly. "You will when you see the cases," the man retorted. 3 of 'em there are. Big 'uns. Where will you have 'em?" Susan came to me for instruction, and I directed that they should be taken through to the museum, the door of which I unlocked for the purpose. The appearance of the cases was undeniably funereal, not in shape only but also in colour, for the dealer, with an ill-timed sense of fitness, had had them painted black, and the effect was heightened by the conduct of the 2 grinning carriers, who bore each case on their shoulders coffin-wise and proceeded to the museum at a slow, funereal walk. And when I was out of sight, though not out of earshot, I heard the leading carrier, who seemed to be somewhat of a humorist, softly whistling the Dead March in Saul. Meanwhile Susan Slodger stood in the hall with a face as white as a tallow candle. She stared with fearful fascination at the long black cases, and uttered no sound, even when the facetious carrier questioned her as to the destination of our dear departed brother. She was absolutely thunderstruck. When the carriers had gone, I directed her to come to the museum and help me to unpack the cases, which she flatly refused to do unless supported by the cook. To this, of course, I had no objection, and when she went off to the kitchen to fetch her colleague, I took up a position just inside the laboratory door and awaited developments. The cases had hinged lids secured with a simple hook, so that when the binding cords were cut there would be no difficulty in ascertaining the nature of the contents. The 2 women came briskly through the lobby, the cook babbling cheerfully and the housemaid silent. But at the museum door they both stopped short, and the former ejaculated, "God! What's this?" Here I stepped out and explained. "These are some cases of specimens for the museum. I want you to unfasten the cords, that's all. I will take out the things myself." With this I went back to the laboratory, but in less than half a minute I heard a series of shrieks, and the 2 women raced through the lobby and disappeared below stairs. After this the position grew worse than ever. Though obviously terrified of me, these 2 women dogged me incessantly, for the excess of material kept me exceedingly busy, and to make things worse, I had received from Jamrach's, without an order, but I had to keep the thing, a dead hyena which had been afflicted with osteodeformans. It was a fine specimen, and was useful as serving to explain my great preoccupation, but it added to my labours and made me impatient of interruptions. The museum wing had an entrance of its own on a side street for the delivery of material, such as the hyena, and this gave me some relief, for I could go out of the front door and slip in by the side entrance. But Susan soon discovered this and thereafter was continually banging at the lobby door to see if I was in. I don't know what she thought. She was an ignorant woman and stupid, but I think she vaguely associated my labours in the laboratory with her absent friends. This perpetual spying on my actions became at last intolerable, and I was on the point of sending the 2 hussies about their business when an accident put an end to the state of affairs. I had gone out of the front door and let myself in by the side entrance, but by some amazing inadvertence had left the lobby door unfastened, and I had barely got on my apron to begin work when I heard someone enter the lobby. Then came a gentle tapping at the door of the laboratory. I took no notice, but waited to see what would happen. The tapping was repeated louder, and yet louder, and still I made no move. Then, after an interval, I heard a wire inserted in the lock. I determined to make a quick end of this. Quietly concealing the material on which I was working, I took down from a hook a large butterfly net. My poor wife had been interested in Lepidoptera. Very softly I tiptoed to the door and suddenly flung it open. There stood Susan Slodger with a hairpin in her hand, absolutely paralyzed with terror. In a moment, before she had time to recover, I slipped the butterfly net over her head. That revived her. With a piercing yell she turned and fled, and with such precipitancy that she pulled the net off the handle. I saw her flying down the lobby with the net over her head, looking like an Oriental bride. I heard the street door bang, and I found the butterfly net on the doormat. But Susan Slodger I never set eyes on again. The cook left me the same day, taking Susan's box with her. It was a great relief. I now had the house to myself and could work without interruption or the discomfort of being spied upon. As to the products of my labors, they are fully set forth in the catalogue, and of this adventure I can only say to the visitor to my museum in the words of the well-known inscription, Si monumentum requiris, circumspice? Such was Challoner's account of his acquisition of the specimens numbered 2, 3, and 4. The descriptions of the preparations were, as he had said, set out in dry and precise detail in the catalogue, and some of the particulars were really quite interesting, as, for instance, the fact that the skull of number 4 combines an extreme degree of dolichocephaly, 67.5, with a cranial capacity of no more than 1,523 cubic centimeters. It was certainly what one might have expected from his conduct. But to the general reader the question which will suggest itself is, what was the state of Challoner's mind? Was he mad? Was he wicked? Or had he merely an unconventional point of view? It is to the latter opinion that I incline after long consideration. He clearly rejected the criminal as a fellow creature and regarded himself as a public benefactor in eliminating him, and perhaps he was right. As to the apparently insane pleasure that he took in the actual captures, I can only say that sane men take pleasure in the slaughter of harmless animals, such as the giraffe, for which they have no need, and other sane men actually go abroad and kill, by barbarous methods, foreign men of estimable character with whom they have no quarrel. This sport they call war, and seem to enjoy it. But killing is killing, and a foreign peasant's life is surely worth more than a British criminal's. This, however, is only obiter dictum, from which many will no doubt dissent. End of chapter 3. Of the Uttermost Farthing. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. The Uttermost Farthing by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 4. The Gifts of Chance. Part 1. The testamentary arrangements of eccentric people must, from time to time, have put their legatees in possession of some very queer property. I call to mind an old gentleman who bequeathed to a distant relative the products of a lifetime of indiscriminate collecting, which products included an obsolete field gun, a stuffed camel, a collection of bottled tapeworms, a fire engine, a church pulpit, and the internal fittings of a public-house bar. And other instances could be quoted, but surely no legatee ever found himself in possession of a queerer legacy than that which my poor friend Challoner had bequeathed to me, when he made over to me the mortal remains of some 24 deceased criminals. The bequest would have been an odd one under any circumstances, but what made it much more so was the strange intimacy that became established between me and the deceased. To the ordinary observer, a skeleton in a museum case or in an art school conveys no vivid sense of humanity. That this bony shape was once an actual person, a me, that walked abroad and wore clothes, that loved and hated, sorrowed and rejoiced, that had friends and lovers, parents and perhaps children, that was, in short, a living man or woman, occurs to him but vaguely. The thing is an osteological specimen, a mere anatomical abstraction. Now these skeletons of Challoner's were quite different. Walking down the long room and looking into the great wall case, I was confronted with actual individuals. Number 1 was Jimmy Archer, who had tried to steal the Blimey teapot. Number 3 was the burglar Fred. I could tell him by the notch on his fifth rib that his comrade's bullet had made. Number 2 was the man who had fired that shot, and Number 4 was Joe, who was 'done in the dark.' I knew them all. The weird museum archives had told me all about them. And as to the rest of that grisly company, strangers to me as yet, the neatly written, Russian-bound volume that Challoner had left would give me their histories too. It was some days before I was able to resume my reading of the uncanny little book, but an unoccupied evening at length gave me the opportunity. As 10 o'clock struck, I put on my slippers, adjusted the light, drew an armchair up to my study fire, and opened the volume at the place marked by the envelope that I had inserted at the end of the last reading. The page was headlined, "Circumstances attending to the acquirement of Numbers 5 and 6," and the account ran as follows. The most carefully conceived plans, when put into practice, are apt to discover unforeseen defects. My elaborate plan for the capture of burglars was no exception to the rule. The idea of employing palpably dishonest servants to act as decoy ducks to lure the burglars on to the premises was an excellent one and had fully answered my expectations. But it had a defect which I had overlooked. The burglars themselves, when reduced to a condition suitable for exhibition in a showcase, were entirely innocuous. There was no danger of their making any indiscreet statements. But with the servants, female servants too, it was quite otherwise. From the shelter of my roof they had gone forth to sow distrust and suspicion in quarters where perfect confidence and trustfulness should prevail. It was a most unfortunate oversight. Now, when it was too late, I saw clearly that they ought never to have left me. I ought to have added them to the collection too. The evil results of the mistake soon became apparent. I had to replace the late cook and housemaid by 2 women of impeachable dishonesty, of whom I had, naturally, great hopes. But nothing happened. I let them handle the plate freely. I gave them the keys of the safe from time to time. I brushed the sham diamond pendants and bracelets under their very noses, and still there was no result. It is true that the silver spoons dwindled in number, and that a stray candlestick or salt cellar would now and again report absent; that the tradesmen's bills were preposterous, and that the tea consumed in a week would have impaired the digestion of a lodge of Good Templars. But that was all. No aspirant for museum honors made his appearance. The concussor became dusty with disuse. The safe in the dining room remained neglected and untouched, and as for the burglar alarm, I had to stand on it myself at stated intervals to keep it in working order. I had already resolved to get rid of these 2 women when they saved me the trouble. I directed them to accompany me to the laboratory to clean out the furnace, whereat they both turned pale and flatly refused. I saw them half an hour later secretly handing their boxes up the area steps to a man with a barrow. Obviously someone had told them something of my methods. The cook and housemaid who succeeded them were jailbirds pure and simple. They were dirty, dishonest, lazy, and occasionally drunk. But for their actual function they were quite useless. They drank my whiskey, they devoured and disturbed my provisions, they stole my portable property, and once, when I had incautiously left the door unfastened, I caught them browsing round the museum. But they brought no grist to my mill. It is true that during their reign I had one visitor, a scurvy little wry-faced knave who sneaked in through the scullery window. But I think he had no connection with them, or he would have entered by some more convenient route and have used a false key instead of a jimmy to open the safe. He was a wretched little creature, and his capture quite uninteresting, for, when he had bitten me twice, he crumpled up like a rag doll, and I carried him to the tank as if he had been a monkey. Yet I ought not to disparage him unduly, for he was the one specimen in my collection, up to that time, who presented the orthodox stigmata of degeneration. His hair was bushy, his face strikingly asymmetrical, and his ears were like a pair of Lombroso's selected examples, outstanding, with enormous Darwinian tubercles and almost devoid of lobules. Still, whatever his points of interest, he was but a stray catch. Chance had brought him as it might bring others of the same kind in the course of years, but this would not answer my purpose. Numbers were what I wanted, and what I had arranged for, and it was with deep disappointment that I recognized that my plan had failed. The supply of anthropological material had come to an end. In a word, the criminal class had smoked me. This was not mere surmise on my part. I had direct and very quaint evidence of it soon after I had completed the preparation of Number 5. I was returning home one evening and was approaching the vicinity of my house when I became aware of a small man of seedy aspect who appeared to be following me. I slackened my pace somewhat to let him overtake or pass me, and when nearly opposite my side door, the museum entrance, he edged alongside and addressed me in a hoarse whisper. "Governor." I halted and looked at him attentively, a proceeding that caused him evident discomfort. "Did you speak to me?" I asked. He edged up closer but still did not meet my eye, and, looking first over one shoulder and then the other, replied, "Yes, I did, governor." "What do you want?" I demanded. He edged up yet closer and said in a hoarse undertone, "I want to know what you've been and done with my cousin Bill." "Your cousin Bill?" I repeated. "Do I know him?" "I don't know whether you know him," was the reply, "but I see him go into your house and I never see him come out again, and I want to know what you've been and done with him." Now here was an interesting circumstance. I had already noted something familiar in the man's face. His question explained it. Cousin Bill was clearly number 5 in the anthropological series. In fact, the resemblance was quite remarkable. The present example, like the late Bill, was an undergrown creature and had the same curiously twisted nose, the same asymmetrical face and similar ears, large, flat ears that stood out from his head like the handles of an amphora, that had strongly marked Darwinian tubercles, uniformed helices, and undeveloped lobules. Lombroso would have loved him. He would have made a delightful photograph for purposes of illustration, and, it suddenly occurred to me, he would make a most interesting companion preparation to number 5. "Your cousin Bill," I said with this new idea in my mind, "was he the son of your mother's sister?" A few details as to heredity add materiality to the value and instructiveness of a specimen. "And supposin' he was? What about it? I want to know what you've been and done with him." "What makes you think I have done anything with him?" I asked. "Why, I see him go into your 'ouse and I never see him come out." "But my good man," I protested, "that is exceedingly bad logic. If you saw him go in, there is a fair presumption that he went in—" "I see him with my own eyes," my friend interrupted, as though there were other alternative means of vision. "But," I continued, "the fact that you did not see him come out establishes no presumption that he did not come out. He may have come out unobserved." "No, he didn't. He never come out. I see him go in. So you have mentioned. May I ask what his business was?" "His business," my acquaintance replied with some hesitation, "was of a private nature." "I see. Did he go in by the front door?" "No, he didn't. He went in by the scullery window." "In the evening, no doubt?" "2 a.m." was the reply. "Ah," said I. "He went in by the scullery window at 2 a.m. on private business. Quite so. Well, you see, the common sense of the position is that if he went into the house and never came out, he must be in the house still." "That's just what I think," my friend agreed. "Very well, then in that case perhaps you would like to stop in and look round to see if you can find him." I took out my latchkey and motioned invitingly towards the museum door. "No, yer don't!" exclaimed the man, backing away hastily down the street. "Yer don't git me in there, so I tell yer straight." "What do you want me to do, then?" "I want to know," he reiterated, "what you've been and done with my cousin Bill. I see him go into—" "I know," I interrupted impatiently. "You've said that before." "And look 'ere, guv'nor," he added, "where did you get all them skillintons from?" Evidently somebody had been talking to this little rascal. "I can't go into questions of that kind, you know," I replied. "No, I don't suppose yer can," he retorted. "But I'll tell yer what I think you've been and done with Bill. You got him in there and you done him in. That's what I think. And I tell yer it ain't the cheese. When a cove goes into a 'ouse for to do some 'armless crack, he stands for to be lagged, if he be as he 'appens to get copped. But he don't stand for to be done in. 'Tain't playing the game. And I ain't a-going to have it." "Then what do you propose to do?" I asked with some curiosity. "I perpose," the little rascal replied haughtily, "for to 'ave the lor on ye. I'm a-going to put the coppers on to this 'ere job." With this he turned somewhat hastily and shambled away up the street at the quick shuffle characteristic of his class. I let myself in at the side door and proceeded to the museum to examine number 5 with renewed interest. The resemblance was remarkable. It was plainly traceable even in the skull and in the proportions of the skeleton generally, while in the small, dry preparation of the head the likeness was ridiculous. It was most regrettable that he should have refused my invitation to come in. As a companion preparation, illustrating the physical resemblances in degenerate families, he would have been invaluable. His conversation and his ludicrous threat of legal proceedings gave me much matter for reflection. To him burglary presented itself as a legitimate sporting pursuit governed by certain rules. The players were respectively the burglar and the householder, of whom the latter staked his property and the former a certain period of personal liberty, and the rules of the game were equally binding on both. It was a conception worthy of comic opera, and yet, incredible as it may seem, it is the very view of crime that is today accepted and acted upon by society. The threat uttered by my diminutive acquaintance had the sound of a broad farce, and so, I may confess, I regarded it. The idea of a burglar proceeding against a householder for hindering him in the execution of his private business might have emanated from the whimsical brain of the late W.S. Gilbert. The quaint topsy-turvydom of it caused me many a chuckle of amusement when I recalled the interview during the next few days; but, of course, I never dreamed of any actual attempts to carry out the threat. Imagine, therefore, my astonishment when I realized that not only had the complaint been made, but the law had actually been set, at least tentatively, in motion. The stunning discovery descended on me with the force of a concussor 3 days after the interview with No. 5's cousin. I was sitting in my study reading Chevenix's Crime against the Person, when the housemaid entered with a visiting card. A gentleman wished to see me to discuss certain scientific matters with me. I looked at the card. It bore the name Mr. James Ramchild, a name quite unknown to me. It was very odd. A scientific colleague would surely have written for an appointment and stated the object of his visit. I looked at the card again. It was printed from a script type instead of the usual engraved plate, and it bore an address in Kennington Park Road. These were weighty facts and a trifle suspicious. I seemed to scent a traveller from beyond the Atlantic, a traveller of commercial leanings. "Show Mr. Ramchild up here," I said, and the housemaid departed, to return anon accompanied by a tall, massive man of somewhat military aspect. I could have laughed aloud, but I did not. It would not have been politic, and it would certainly not have been polite. But I chuckled inwardly as I offered my visitor a chair. Experientia docet. I had seen quite a number of plain-clothes police officers in the last few months, and the present specimen would have been typical even without his boots. I prepared to enjoy myself. "I have taken the liberty of calling on you, Mr. Challoner," my visitor began, "to make a few inquiries concerning skeletons." I nodded gravely and smothered a giggle. He was a simple soul, this Ramchild. Concerning skeletons! What an expression for a man of science to use! An artless creature indeed. A veritable Ramchild of nature, so to speak. "I understand," he continued, "that you have a famous collection of skeletons." I nodded again. Of course I had not anything of the kind. Mine was only a little private collection, but it was of no consequence. "So," he concluded, "I have called to ask you if you would be so kind as to let me see them." "From whom did you hear of my collection?" I asked. "It was mentioned to me by my friend, Mr. Winterbottom of Cambridge." "Ah," I said, "I remember Winterbottom very well. How is he?" "He is very well, thank you," replied the detective, looking mightily surprised, and not without reason, seeing that he had undoubtedly invented the name Winterbottom on the spur of the moment. "Is there any branch of the subject that you are especially interested in?" I asked, purposely avoiding giving him a lead. "No," he replied. "No, not particularly. The fact is that I thought of starting a collection myself if it wouldn't be too expensive. But you have a regular museum, haven't you?" "Yes. Come and have a look at it." He rose with alacrity, and I led him through the dining room to the museum wing, and I noticed that, if he did not know much about osteology, he was uncommonly observant of the details of house construction. He looked very hard at the safe, the mahogany casing of which failed to disguise its nature from the professional eye, and noted the massive door that gave entrance to the museum wing and the Yale lock that secured it. In the museum his eye riveted itself on the 5 human skeletons in the great wall case, but I perversely led him to the case containing my curious collections of abnormal, deformed skeletons of the lower animals. "There," I said complacently, "that is my little hoard. Is there any specimen that you would like to take out and examine?" He gazed vaguely into the case and murmured that they were all very interesting, and again I caught his eye wandering to the great case opposite. I was in the act of reaching out a porcupine, with an ankylosed knee joint, when he plucked up courage to say frankly, "The fact is, I'm principally interested in human skeletons." I replaced the porcupine and walked across to the great wall case. "I am sorry I have not more to show you," I said apologetically. "This is only the beginning of a collection, you see. But still, the specimens are of considerable interest. Don't you find them so?" Apparently he did, for he scrutinized the dates on the dwarf pedestals with the deepest attention and finally remarked, "I see you have written a date on each of these. What does that signify?" "The dates are those on which I acquired the respective specimens," I answered. "Oh, indeed." He reflected, with a profound speculative eye on number 5. I judged that he was trying to recall a date furnished by number 5's cousin, and that he would have liked to consult his notebook. "The particulars," I said, "are too lengthy to put on the labels, but they are set out in detail in the catalogue." "Can I see the catalogue?" he asked eagerly. "Certainly." I produced a small manuscript volume, not the catalogue which is attached to the archives, but a dummy that I had prepared for such a contingency as had arisen, and handed it to him. He opened it with avidity and, turning at once to number 5, began, with manifest disappointment, to read the description aloud. 5. Male skeleton of Teutonic type exhibiting well-marked characteristics of degeneration. The skull is asymmetrical, subdolichocephalic. He pronounced this word subdolichocephalic, and paused abruptly, turning rather red. It is an awkward word. "Yes," he said, closing the catalogue. "Very interesting. Very remarkable. Exceedingly so. I should very much like to possess a skeleton like that." "You are much better off with the one you have got," I remarked. "Oh, I don't mean that," he rejoined hastily. "I mean that I should like to acquire a specimen like this number 5 for my proposed collection. Now how could I get one?" "Well," I said reflectively, "there are several ways." I paused and he gazed at me expectantly. "You could, for instance," I continued slowly, "provide yourself with a lasso and take a walk down Whitechapel High Street." "Good gracious!" he exclaimed excitedly. "Do you really mean to say that—" "Certainly," I interrupted. "You would find an abundance of material. For my own part, not being gifted with your exceptionally fine physique, I have to adopt the more prosaic and expensive plan of buying my specimens from the dealers." "Quite so. Quite so," he agreed. He was deeply disappointed and inclined to be huffy. "Of course you were joking about the lasso. But would you mind giving me the address of the dealer from whom you obtained this specimen?" And once more he pointed to Cousin Bill. He thought he had cornered me, and so he would have done if I had been less cautious. I congratulated myself on the wisdom and foresight that had led me to provide myself with those dummy skeletons. For now I held him in the hollow of my hand. "That specimen?" I said, scanning the date on the pedestal. "I fancy I got it from Hammerstein. You know his place in the 7 Dials, no doubt. A very useful man. I get most of my human osteology from him." I fetched my receipt file and turned over the papers in leisurely fashion while he gnawed his lips with impatience. At last I found the receipted invoice and he read it aloud with a ludicrous expression of disappointment. "Complete set superfine human osteology strongly articulated with best brass wire and screw bolts, with springs to mandible and stout iron supporting rod. All bones guaranteed to be derived from the same subject. £5 3 4." The invoice was headed "Oscar Hammerstein, dealer in osteology, Great St. Andrew Street, London, W.C.," and was dated 4th February, 1891. The detective entered the name and address in a black bound notebook of official aspect, compared the date with that on Cousin Bill's pedestal, and prepared to depart. "There is one thing I must point out to you," I said, anticipating an early visit on my friend's part to Mr. Hammerstein. "The skeletons as you get them from the dealers are not always up to museum style in point of finish. They are often of a bad color and may be stained with grease. If they are, you will have to disarticulate them, clean them with benzoil and, if necessary, rematriculate and bleach. But whatever you do," I continued solemnly, "be careful with the chlorinated soda or you will spoil the appearance of the bones and make them brittle. Good-bye." I shook his hand effusively and he took his departure very glum and crestfallen. End of Part 1. of the Uttermost Farthing. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. The Uttermost Farthing by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 4. The Gifts of Chance. Part 2. As long as he had been with me, something of the old buoyant spirit of playfulness, that was my ordinary mood until my great trouble befell, had been revived by the absurdity of the situation. But his departure left me rather depressed, for his visit marked the final collapse of my scheme. Even if the criminal classes had been willing to continue the supply of anthropological material, my methods could not have been carried out under the watchful and disapproving eyes of the police. What then was to be done? This was the question that I asked myself again and again. As to abandoning my activities, of course, such an idea never occurred to me. I remained alive for a definite purpose: to search for the man who had murdered my wife and to exact from him payment of his debt. Of this purpose, the collection had been, at first, a mere by-product; and though it was gradually taking such hold of me as to become a purpose in itself, it was but a minor purpose. The discovery of that unknown wretch was the Mecca of my earthly pilgrimage, from which no difficulties or obstacles should divert me. The hint that ultimately guided me into new fields of research came to me by the merest chance. A few days after the visit of the detective, I received a letter from one of my few remaining friends, a Dr. Grayson, who had formerly practised in London as a physician, but who, owing to age and infirmity, had retired to his native place, the village of Shome, near Rochester. Grayson asked me to spend a day with him, that we might talk over some matters in which we were both interested; and, being now rather at a loose end, I accepted the invitation, but declined to sleep away from my home and my collection. It is significant of my state of mind at this time that, before starting, I considered what weapon I should take with me. Formerly I should no more have thought of arming myself for a simple railway journey than of putting on a coat of mail. But now a train suggested a train robber, a Lefroy, with a very unsubmissive Mr. Gold, and the long tunnel near Strood was but the setting of a railway tragedy. My ultimate choice of weapon, too, is interesting. The familiar revolver I rejected utterly. There must be no noise. My quarrel with the criminal was a personal one in which no outsiders must be allowed to meddle. I should have preferred the concussor, which I now handled with skill, but it was hardly a portable tool, and my choice ultimately fell on a very fine sword stick, supplemented by a knuckle duster which had been bequeathed to me by one of my clients after trial on my own countenance. And after all, nothing happened. I got into an empty first-class compartment, and when, just as the train was starting, a burly fellow dashed in and slammed the door, I eyed him suspiciously and waited for developments. But there were none. The fellow sat huddled in a corner, watching me and keeping an eye on the handle of the alarm over his head, but he made no sign. When we emerged from the long tunnel he was white as a ghost, and he hopped out on to Strood platform almost before the train had begun to slow down. I reached my bag down from the rack and got out after him, smiling at my own folly. The criminal was becoming an obsession of which I must beware if I would not end my days in an asylum; a fact which was further impressed on me when I saw my late fellow passenger, who had just caught sight of me, legging it down the station approach like a professional pedestrian and looking back nervously over his shoulder. Resolving firmly to put the subject out of my mind, I walked slowly into the town and betook myself to the London road; and though, as I passed the Falstaff Inn and crossed Gad's Hill, fleeting reminiscences of Prince Harry and the men in buckram came unsought, with later suggestions of a stage-coach struggling up the hill in the dark and masked figures creeping down the banks into the sunken road, I kept to my good resolution. The bag was a little cumbersome. It contained a large parcel of bulbs from Covent Garden that Grayson had asked me to bring; and yet it was pleasant to break off from the high road and to stray by well-remembered tracks and footpaths across the fields. It was all familiar ground, for in years gone by, when Grayson was in practice, we would come down together for week-ends to his little demesne, and often I would stay on alone for a week or so and ramble about the country by myself. So I knew every inch of the countryside and was so much interested in renewing my acquaintance with it that I was 20 minutes late for lunch. I had a most agreeable day with Grayson, who was working at the historical aspects of disease, and would have stayed later than I did, but at about 8:30 (we had dined at 7), Grayson began to be restless and fidgety, and at last said, apologetically: "Don't think me inhospitable, Challoner, but if you aren't going to stay the night you had better be going. And we don't go by Gad's Hill. Take the road down to Higham and catch the train there. "Why, what is the matter with Gad's Hill?" I asked. "Nothing much by daylight, but a great deal at night. It has always been an unsafe spot, and is especially just now. There has been quite an epidemic of highway robberies lately. They began when the Hoppers were here last autumn, but some of those East End ruffians seem to have settled in the neighborhood. I have seen some very queer looking characters even in this village, aliens, apparently, of the kind that you see about Stepney and Whitechapel. Now, you get down to Higham like a good fellow before the country settles down for the night." Needless to say, the prowling alien had no terrors for me, but as Grayson was really uneasy, I made no demur and took my leave almost immediately. But I did not make directly for Higham. The moon was up and the village looked very inviting. Tree and chimney stack, thatched roof and gable end cut pleasant shapes of black against the clear sky, and patches of silvery light fell athwart the road on wooden palings and weather-boarded fronts. I strolled along the little street, carrying the now light and empty bag, and exchanging greetings with scattered villagers, until I came to the lane that turns down toward the London road. Here, by a triangular patch of green, I halted and mechanically looked at my watch, holding it up to the moonlight. I was about to replace it when a voice asked, "What's the right time, mister?" I looked up sharply. The man who had spoken was sitting on the bank under the hedge, and in such deep shadow I had not noticed him. Nor could I see much of him now, though I observed that he seemed to be taking some kind of refreshment. But the voice was not a Kentish voice, nor even an English one. It seemed to engraft an unfamiliar, guttural accent on the dialect of East London. I told the man the time and asked him if the road, pointing to the Ridgeway, would take me to Higham. Of course I knew it would not, and I have no very distinct idea why I asked, but he answered promptly enough, "Yes, straight down the road. Was you wanting to get to the station?" I replied that I was, and he added, "You go straight down the road a mile and a half and you'll see the station right in front of you." Now, here was palpable misdirection, obviously intentional, too, for the circumstantiality excluded the idea of a mistake. He was deliberately sending me, an ostensible stranger, along a solitary side road that led to the heart of the country. With what object? I had very little doubt, and that doubt should soon be set at rest. I thanked him for his information and set out along the road at an easy pace. But when I had gone a little way, I lengthened my stride so as to increase my speed without altering the rhythm of my footfalls. As I went, I speculated on the intentions of my friend and noted with interest and a little surprise that I was quite without fear of him. I suspected him of being a footpad, one of the gang of which Grayson had spoken, and I had set forth along this unfrequented road in a spirit of mere curiosity to see if it were really so. Presently I came to a gate at the entrance of a cart track, and here I halted to listen. From the road behind me came the sound of footsteps, quick steps, but not sharp and crisp, rather of a shuffling, stealthy quality. I climbed quietly over the gate and took up a position behind the trunk of an elm that grew in the hedgerow. The footsteps came on apace. Soon, round a bend of the moon-lighted road, a figure appeared, moving forward rapidly, and keeping in the shadow there was. I watched it through the thick hedge as it approached and resolved itself into a seedy-looking man carrying a thick-knobbed stick. Opposite the gate the man halted and, as I could see by his shadow, looked across the silvery fields that stretched away down to the valley and listened, but only for a few moments. Then he started forward again at something between a quick walk and a slow trot. As soon as he had gone I came out and began to walk down the cart track. My figure must have stood out conspicuously on the bare field and must have been plainly visible from the Ridgeway. I did not hurry. Pursuing my way quietly down the gentle slope, I went on for some 300 yards until the ground fell away more steeply, and here, before descending, I looked over my shoulder. A man was getting over the gate. I walked on more quickly now until I topped a second rise, and then again I looked back. The figure of a man stood out on the brow of the hill, black against the moonlit sky, and now he was hurrying forward in undisguised pursuit. I quickened my pace and looked about me. The night was calm and lovely, the fields bathed in silvery light and the wooded upland shrouded in a soft grey shadow, from the heart of which a single lighted window gleamed forth, a spot of rosy warmth. The bark of a watchdog came softened by distance from some solitary farmstead, and far away below the hoot of a steamer creeping up the river to the twinkling anchorage. Presently I came to a spot where the rough road divided. One well-worn track led down towards the footpath that ultimately enters the London road. A fainter track led, as I knew, to an old chalk pit where, in mysterious caverns, the farm carts rested through the winter months. Here I halted for a moment as if in doubt. The man was now less than 100 yards behind me and walking as fast as he could. I turned round and looked at him. He appeared once more to hesitate, and then started at a run along the track to the chalk pit. There was no disguise about the man's intentions. As I started off, he broke into a run and followed, but he did not hail me to stop. I supposed he knew whither the path led. But if his purpose was definite, so was mine, and again I noted with a faint surprise that I had no feeling of nervousness. My contact with the criminal class had left me with nothing but a sentiment of hostile contempt. That a criminal might kill me never presented itself as a practical possibility. I was only concerned in inducing him to give me a fair pretext for killing him. So I ran on, wondering if my pursuer had ringed hair, if it were possible that, in this remote place and by this chance meeting, I might find the object of my quest, and conscious of that fierce, playful delight that always came over me when I was hunting the enemies of my race. For, of course, I was now hunting the fellow behind me, although the poor devil supposed he was hunting me. When the track approached the chalk pit, it descended rather suddenly. I ran down between two clumps of bushes into the weed-grown area at the bottom, past the row of caverns wherein the wagons were even now lurking unseen, and on until the track ended among a range of mole-hills in a sort of bay encompassed by the time-stained cliff. Here I wheeled about, putting down my bag and facing my pursuer. "Stand off," I said sharply. "What are you following me for?" The man stopped and then approached more slowly. "Look 'ere, mister," he said. "I don't want to hurt yer. You needn't be afeard of me." "Well," I said, "what do you want?" "I'll tell yer," he said confidentially. "I'm a pore man, I am. I ain't got no watch. I ain't got no money, and I can't get no work. Now you're a rich man. You've got a very 'andsome watch. I see it. And lots more at 'ome, I dessay. Well, you makes me a present of that watch, that's what you do, and any small change that you got about yer. You do that and I'll let yer go peaceable." "And supposing I don't?" "Then some of them farm blokes'll find a dead man in a chalk pit. And it ain't no good for you to holler. There ain't no one within a mile of this place. So you pass over that watch and turn out your bloomin' pockets." "Do I understand—" I began, but he interrupted me savagely. "Oh, shut your face and hand over, d'ye hear?" He advanced threateningly, grasping his bludgeon by the smaller end. But when he had approached within a couple of paces, I made a sudden lunge with my stick, introducing its ferrule to his abdomen about the region of the solar plexus. He sprang back with an astonished yelp which sounded like "Ower!" and stood gasping and rubbing his abdomen. As he recovered, he broke out into absurd and disgusting speech and began cautiously to circle round me, balancing his club in readiness for a smashing blow. "You wait till I done with yer," he said, watching for a chance. "I'll make yer pay for that. I'm a-goin' to do yer in, I am. You'll look ugly when I've finished. Ower! Ower!" The concluding exclamation was occasioned by the ferrule of my stick impinging on the fleshy part of his chest, and, as he uttered it, he sprang back out of range. After this he kept a greater distance, but continued to circle round and pour out an unceasing torrent of foul words. But he had not the faintest idea how to use a stick, whereas my practice with the foils at the gymnasium had made me quite skilful. From time to time he raised his bludgeon and ran in at me, but a sharp prod under the upraised arm always sent him leaping back out of reach with the inevitable "Ower!" His lack of skill deprived the encounter of much of its interest. I think he felt this himself, for I saw him looking about furtively as if in search of something. Then he espied a large and knobby flint, and would have picked it up, but as he was stooping I applied the point of my stick so vigorously that he staggered back with yelps of pain. And now it was suddenly borne in upon me that he had had enough. I realized it just in time to plant myself on the track between him and the entrance to the chalk pit. He was still as savage and murderous as ever, but his nerve was gone. He shrank away from me, and as I followed closely he tried again and again to dodge past toward the opening. "Look 'ere, mister," he said at length. "You chuck it, and I'll let yer go peaceable." "Let me go!" I laughed scornfully, but stood my ground. And yet it was unpleasant. One cannot go on hammering a beaten man, and it is difficult to refuse a surrender. On the other hand, it was out of the question to let this fellow go. He had come here prepared to murder me for a paltry watch and a handful of loose change. Common justice and my duty to my fellow men demanded his elimination. Besides, if I let him escape into the open, what would happen? The fields were sprinkled with big flints. It was practically certain that I should never leave the neighborhood alive. Even as I stood hesitating, he furnished an illustrative commentary on my thoughts. Springing back from me, he suddenly stooped and caught up a great flint nodule, and though I ducked quickly as he flung it and so avoided its full force, I caught such a buffet as it glanced off the side of my head as convinced me that a settlement must be speedily arrived at. Rushing in on him, I bore him backwards till he was penned up in the entrance of one of the caverns against the shafts of a wagon. Then suddenly he changed his tactics. Realizing at last that a clumsily wielded bludgeon is powerless against a stick expertly handled rapierwise, he dropped his club, and the next moment the moonbeams flashed from the broad blade of a knife. This was quite a different affair. He now stood on guard with the knife poised and his left hand outspread, ready to snatch at my stick. It was a much more effective plan, only he did not know that inside my stout malacca reposed a keen Toledo sword blade. I slipped my thumb on the press button of the sword stick and watched him. From time to time he made a dash at me with his knife, and when I prodded him back he snatched at the stick. Again and again he nearly caught it, but I was just a little too quick for him, and he fell back gasping and cursing on the wagon shafts. And then the end came with inevitable suddenness. He rushed out on me with upraised knife. I stopped him with a vigorous poke in the chest, but before I could whisk away the stick he had clutched it with a howl of joy. I gave a final drive, pressed the button and sprang back, leaving the scabbard end in his hand. Before he had realized what had happened, he darted out, brandishing the knife, and came fairly on the point of the sword blade. At the same moment I must have lunged, although I was not aware of it, for when he staggered back the handle was against his breast. It was over, and I had hardly realized that the final stage had begun. In an instant, as it seemed, that yelping, murderous wretch had subsided into a huddled, inert heap. It was a quick and merciful dispatch. By the time I had cleaned the blade and replaced it in its scabbard, the last twitchings had ceased. As I stood and looked down at him, I felt something of the chill of an anticlimax. It had all gone off so easily. Now that it was finished, my thoughts went back to the final purpose of my quest. Was this man by any chance the wretch whom I was seeking? It did not seem likely, and yet the possibility must be considered. The first question was as to his hair. Stooping down with my pocket scissors, I cut off a good-sized lock and secured it in an envelope for future examination. Then, taking out my pocket-book, I pressed his fingers on some of the blank pages. The natural surface of his hands offered a passable substitute for ink, and the fingerprints could be further developed at home. Then arose a more difficult question. I naturally wished to add him to my collection, but the thing seemed impossible. I certainly could not take him away with me. But if I left him exposed he would undoubtedly be found and buried, and thus an excellent specimen would be lost to science. There was only one thing to be done. The middle of the chalk pit was occupied by a large area covered with nettles and other large weeds. Probably no human being trod on that space from one year's end to another, for the stinging nettles, 4 or 5 feet high, were enough to keep off stray children. Even now the spring vegetation was coming up apace. If I placed the body inconspicuously in the middle of the weedy area, it would soon be overgrown and hidden. Then the natural agencies would do the rougher part of my work. Necrophagous insects and other vermin would come to the aid of air, moisture, and bacteria, and I could return in the autumn and gather up the bones, all ready for the museum. This rather makeshift plan I proceeded to execute. Transporting the material to the middle of the weed-grown space, I covered it lightly with twigs and various articles of loose rubbish. It was now quite invisible, and I was turning away to go when suddenly I bethought me of the dry preparation of the head that ought to accompany the skeleton. Without that, the specimen would be incomplete, and an incomplete specimen would spoil the series. I reflected a while. It seemed a pity to spoil the completeness of the series for the sake of a little trouble. I had a good-sized bag with me, and a quantity of stout brown paper in it, in which the bulbs had been wrapped. Why not? In the end, I decided that the series should not be spoilt. I need not describe the obvious details of the simple procedure. When I came up out of the chalk pit a quarter of an hour later, my bag contained the material for the required preparation of a mummified head. I soon struck the familiar footpath and set forth at a brisk pace to catch the late train from Gravesend. It was a long walk, and a pleasant one, though the bag was uncomfortably heavy. I thought, with grim amusement, of Grayson's gang of footpads. It would be a quaint situation if I encountered some of them and was robbed of my bag. The possibilities that the idea opened out were highly diverting and kept me entertained until I at last reached Gravesend Station, and was bundled by the guard into a first-class compartment just as the train was starting. I should have preferred an empty compartment, but there was no choice, and as 3 of the corners were occupied I took possession of the 4th. The rack over my seat was occupied by a bag about the size of my own, apparently the property of a clergyman who sat in the opposite corner, so I had to place my bag on the rack over his head. I watched him during the journey as he sat opposite to me reading the Church Times and wondered how he would feel if he knew what was in the bag above him. Probably he would have been quite disturbed, for many of these clerics entertained the quaintest of old world ideas. And he was mighty near to knowing, too, for when the train had stopped at Hither Green and was just about to move off, he suddenly sprang up, exclaiming, "God bless my soul!" and snatching my bag from the rack, darted out on the platform. I immediately grabbed his bag from my rack and rushed out after him as the train started, hailing him to stop. "Hi, my good sir, you've taken my bag!" "Not at all," he replied indignantly. "You're quite mistaken." And then, as I held out his own bag, he looked from one to the other and, to my horror, pressed the clasp of my bag and pulled it wide open. On what small chances do great events turn! But for the brown paper in my bag there would have been a catastrophe. As it was, when his eyes lighted on that rough, globular paper parcel, he handed my bag to me with an apologetic smirk and received his own in exchange. But after that I kept my property in my hand until I was safe within the precincts of my laboratory. The usual disappointments awaited me when I came to examine the hair and finger prints. He was not the man whom I sought. But he made an acceptable addition to the series of criminal anthropology in my museum, for I duly collected the bones from the great nettle bed in the chalk pit early in the following September, and set them, properly bleached and riveted together, in the large wall case. But this specimen had a further, though indirect, value. From him I gathered a useful hint by which I was subsequently guided into a new and fruitful field of research. See Catalogue Numbers 6A and 6B. End of Chapter 4. One of the Uttermost Farthing. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. The Uttermost Farthing by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 5. By-products of Industry. Part 1. The next entry in the amazing museum archives exhibited my poor friend Humphrey Challoner in circumstances that were to me perfectly incredible. When I recall that learned, cultivated man as I knew him, I find it in shop in an East End by-street. Yet this appears actually to have been his condition at one time. But let me quote the entry in his own words, which need no comments of mine to heighten their strangeness. Events connected with the acquirement of numbers 7, 8, and 9 in the anthropological series. We are the creatures of circumstance. Blind chance, which guided that unknown wretch to my house in the dead of the night and which led my dear wife to her death at his murderous hands, also impelled that other villain, number 6, anthropological series, to pursue me to the lonely chalk pit, where he would have done me to death had I not fortunately anticipated his intentions. So, too, it was by a mere chance that I presently found myself the proprietor of a shop in a Whitechapel back street. Let me trace the connections of events. The first link in the chain was a visit that I had paid in my younger days to Moscow and Warsaw, where I had stayed long enough to acquire a useful knowledge of Russian and Yiddish. The second link was the failure of my plan to lure the murderer of my wife, and incidentally other criminals, to my house. The trap had been scented not only by the criminals but also by the police, of whom one had visited my museum, with very evident suspicion as to the nature of my specimens. After the visit of the detective I was rather at a loose end. That unknown wretch was still at large. He had to be found, and I had to find him, since the police could not. But how? That detective had completely upset my plans, and, for a time, I could think of no other. Then came the dirty rascal who had tried to murder me in the chalk pit, and from his mongrel jargon, half Cockney, half foreign, I had gathered a vague hint. If I could not entice the criminal population into my domain, how would it be to reconnoitre theirs? The alien area of London was well known to me, for it had always seemed interesting since my visit to Warsaw, and, judging from the police reports, it appeared to be a veritable happy hunting ground for the connoisseur in criminals. Hence it was that my unrest led me almost daily to perambulate that strange region east of Aldgate, where uncouth foreign names stare out from the shop signs, and almost every public or private notice is in the Hebrew character. Dressed in my shabbiest clothes, I trudged, hour after hour and day after day, through the grey and joyless streets and alleys, looking earnestly into the beady eyes and broad faces of the East European wayfarers, and wondering whether any of them was the man I sought. One evening, as I was returning homeward through the district that lies at the rear of Middlesex Street, my attention was arrested by a large card tacked on the door of a closed shop. A dingy barber's pole gave a clue to the nature of the industry formerly carried on, and the card, which was written upon in fair and even scholarly Hebrew characters, supplied particulars. I had stopped to read the inscription, faintly amused at the incongruity between the recondite Oriental lettering and the matter-of-fact references to eligible premises and fixtures and goodwill, when the door opened and two men came out. One was a typical English Jew, smart, chubby, and prosperous. The other was evidently a foreigner. Both men stood aside to enable me to continue my reading, and, as I was about to turn away, the smarter of the two addressed me. "Good chance here, mister. Nice a little business going for nothing. No charge for goodwill or fixtures. Ready-made business, and nothing to pay but rent." "Ja," the other man broke in. "Dat shop is a leetle gold mine, und you buys 'im for noting." It was an absurd situation. I was beginning smilingly to shake my head when the Jew resumed eagerly. "I tell you, mister, it's a chance in a million. A fifth-class business, and not a brown to pay for the goodwill. Come in and have a look round," he added persuasively. I suppose I am curious by nature. At any rate, I am sure it was nothing but idle curiosity to see what the interior of a Whitechapel house was like that led me to follow the two men into the dark and musty-smelling shop. But hardly had my eyes lighted on the frowsy fixtures and appurtenances of the trade when there flashed into my mind a really luminous idea. "Why did the last man leave?" I asked. The Jew caught hold of my coat and exclaimed impressively, "The last man wath a fool. Got himself mixed up with the crooketh. Set up a roulette table in the cellar and let 'em come in and gamble away their thwag. Thupid thing to do, though, mind you, he did a rare good line while it lasted. Got the shtuff for nothing, you thee." His tone at this point was regretfully sympathetic. "What happened in the end?" I asked. "The copperth dropped on him. Somebody gave him away." "Some of the ladies, perhaps," I suggested. "Ach, so!" the other man burst in fiercely. "Of course it vas der women. It is always der women. Dese damn women, dey makes all der trouble." He thumped on the table with his fist and then catching the Hebrew's eye, suddenly subsided into silence. From the shop we proceeded to the little parlour behind, from which a door gave access by a flight of most dangerous stone steps to the large cellar. This was lighted by a grating from the backyard, with which it also communicated by a flight of steps and a door. We next examined the yard itself, a small paved enclosure with a gate opening on an alley, and occupied at the moment by an empty beer barrel, a builder's handcart, and a dead cat. "Like to thee the up there room?" inquired the Hebrew gentleman, whose name I understood to be Nathan. I nodded abstractedly, and followed him up the stairs, gathering a general impression of all-pervading dirt. The upper rooms were of no interest to me after what I had seen downstairs. "Well," said Mr. Nathan, when we were once back in the shop, "what do you think of it?" I did not answer his question literally. If I had, I should have startled him, for I thought the place absolutely ideal for my purpose. Just consider its potentialities. I was searching for a criminal whom I could identify by his hair. Here was a barber shop in the heart of a criminal neighbourhood, and admittedly the late haunt of criminals. Those criminals were certain to come back. I could examine their hair at my leisure, and there was the cellar. It was, I repeat, absolutely ideal. "I think the place will suit me," I said. Mr. Nathan beamed on me. "Of course," he said, "references will be necessary, or rent in advance." "A year's rent in advance will do, I suppose?" said I, and Mr. Nathan nearly jumped clear off the floor. A few minutes later I departed, the accepted tenant, under the pseudonym of Simon Vosper, of Samuel Nathan, with the understanding that I should deliver my advance rent in bank notes, and that he should have the top dressing of dirt removed from the house and the name of Vosper painted over the shop. My preparations for the new activities on which I was to enter were quickly made. In my Bloomsbury house I installed as caretaker a retired sergeant major of incomparable taciturnity. I locked up the museum wing and kept the keys. I took a few lessons in hair cutting from a West End barber. I paid my advanced rent, sent in a set of bedroom furniture to my new premises in Saul Street, Whitechapel, abandoned the habit of shaving for some 10 days, and then took possession of the shop. At first the customers were few and far between. A stray coster or carman came in from time to time, but mostly the shop was silent and desolate. But this did not distress me. I had various preparations to make and a plan of campaign to settle. There were the cellar stairs, for instance, a steep flight of stone steps unguarded by baluster or handrail. They were very dangerous, but when I had fitted a sort of giant stride by suspending a stout rope from the ceiling, I was able to swing myself down the whole flight in perfect safety. Other preparations consisted in the placing of an iron safe in the parlour, with a small mirror above it, and the purchase of a tin of stiff cart grease and a few large barrels. These latter I bought from a cooper in the form of staves and hoops, and built them up in the cellar in my rather extensive spare time. Meanwhile trade gradually increased. The harmless coster and labourer began to be varied by customers rather more in my line. In fact, I had not quite completed my arrangements when I got the first windfall. It was a Wednesday evening. I had nearly finished shaving a large military-looking labourer when the door opened very quietly and a seedy, middle-aged man entered and sat down. His movements were silent, almost stealthy, and when he had seated himself, he picked up a newspaper, from behind which I saw him steal furtive and suspicious glances at the patient in the operating chair. The latter, being scraped clean, rose to depart, and the newcomer underwent a total eclipse behind the newspaper. "'Who's 'e?' he demanded when the labourer was safely outside. "'I don't know him,' I replied, "'but I should say, by his hands, a labourer.' "'Looked rather like a copper,' said my customer. He took his place in the vacated chair with a laconic 'aircut, and then became conversational. "'So you've took on Polensky's job?' I nodded in the mirror that faced us. Polensky was my predecessor, and he continued, "'Polensky's doing time, ain't he?' I believed he was, and said so, and my friend then asked, "'Young Pongo ever come in here now?' Naturally, I had never heard of young Pongo, but I felt that I must not appear too ignorant. It were better to invent a little. "'Pongo,' I ruminated. "'Pongo. Is that the fellow who was with Joe Bartels in this job you know?' "'No, I don't,' said my friend. "'And 'oo's Joe Bartels?' "'Oh, I thought you knew him. But if you don't, I'd better say no more. You see, I don't know who you are.' "'Don't yer? Then I'll tell yer. I'm Spotty Bamber, of Spitalfields, that's who I am. So now you know.' I made a mental note of the name, the first part of which had apparently been suggested by Mr. Bamber's complexion, and my attention must have wandered somewhat, for my patient suddenly shouted, "'Ere! I say! I didn't come 'ere to be scalped. I come to 'ave my 'air cut.' I apologized and led the conversation back to Polensky. "'Ah,' said Bamber, "'e was a downy 'un, 'e was. Bit too downy. Opened his mouth too wide. Wanted it all for nix. That was why he got peached on.' Here Spotty turned his head with a jerk. "'What are you looking at me through that thing for? My 'ead ain't as small as all that.' That thing was a Coddington lens, through which I examined the hair of every customer with a view to identification. But I did not tell Mr. Bamber this. My explanation was recondite and rather obscure, but it seemed to satisfy him. "'Well,' he said, "'you're a rum cove. Talk like a bloomin' toff, too, you do.' I made a careful mental note of that fact and determined to study the local dialect. Meanwhile I explained, "I wasn't always a hairdresser, you know." "So I should suppose," answered Spotty, twisting his neck to get a look at his pole in the glass. "What you'd call a bloomin' amchor." He stood up, shook himself, and tendered a half-crown in payment, which I examined carefully before giving change. Then I brought out of my pocket a handful of assorted coins, including 2 sovereigns, a quantity of silver, and some coppers. I do not ordinarily carry my money mixed up in this slovenly fashion, but had adopted the habit, since I came to the shop, for a definite reason, and was now justified by the avaricious glare that lighted up in Spotty's eyes at the sight of the coins in my hand. I picked out his change deliberately and handed it to him, when he took it and stood for a few seconds, evidently thinking hard. Suddenly he thrust his hand into his pocket and said, "I suppose, mister, you haven't got such a thing as a 5 pun note, what you can give me in exchange for 5 jimmies?" He held out 5 sovereigns, which I took from him and inspected critically. "Oh, they're all right," said Spotty, as I weighed them in my hand. And so they were. "I think I can let you have a note if you will wait a moment," I said, and as I turned to enter the parlour, Spotty sat down ostentatiously in the chair. I drew the door to after me, but did not latch it. A small jet of gas was burning in the parlour, and by its light I unlocked the safe, pulled out a drawer, took from it a bundle of bank notes and looked them over, all very deliberately and with my eye on the mirror that hung above the safe. That mirror reflected the door. It also reflected me, but as the light was on my back, my face was in the shadow. Hardly had I opened the safe when, slowly and silently, the door opened a couple of inches and an eye appeared in the space. I picked a note out of the bundle, returned the remainder to the drawer, closed the safe and slowly walked to the door. When I re-entered the shop, Spotty was seated in the chair as I had left him, with the immovable air of an Egyptian statue. I have no doubt that Spotty Bamber chuckled with joy when he got outside. I should like to think so, to feel that our pleasure was mutual. For as to me, my feelings can only be appreciated by some patient angler who, after a long and fruitless setting, has seen his quill or cork sink down with eager bite of perch on bleak or dace. Spotty was on the hook. He would come again, and not alone, at least I trusted not alone, for my brief inspection of his hair had convinced me that he was not the unknown man whom I sought, and though he would make an acceptable addition to the group of specimens in the long wall case, I was more interested in the companion whom I felt confident he would bring with him. The elation of spirit produced by the prospect of this second visit was such that I forthwith closed the shop and spent the rest of the evening exercising with the concussor and practising flying leaps down the cellar steps with the aid of the giant's stride. I slept little that night. As a special precaution against failure, I had left the back gate unbolted and refrained from locking the outside cellar door, with the sole result that I was roused up at 1 a.m. by a meddlesome constable and rebuked sourly for my carelessness. Otherwise not a soul came to enliven my solitude. The second night passed in the same dull fashion, leaving me restless and disappointed. And when the third slipped by without a sign of a visitor, I became uneasy. The fourth day was Saturday, and late evening, the end of the Sabbath, turned my shop into a veritable land of Goshen. The conversation, mostly in Yiddish, of which I professed total ignorance, kept me pretty well amused until closing time arrived. Then, as the shop emptied, my hopes and fears began to revive together. I was about to begin shutting up the premises when the door opened softly and a man slipped into the shop. My heart leaped exultingly. The man was Spotty Bamber. And he was not alone. By no means. 2 more men strolled in the same stealthy fashion, and having first glanced at one another, and then peered suspiciously round the shop, they all looked at me. For my part, I regarded them with deep interest, especially as to their hair. Habitual criminal was written large on all of them. As anthropological material they were quite excellent. Mr. Bamber opened the proceedings with one eye on me and the other on the door. "Look 'ere, mister, we've come about a little matter of business. You know Polensky used to do a bit of trade?" "Yes," I said, "and now he's doing a bit of time." "I know," replied Spotty, "but you must take that fat with the lean. It ain't all soup. And you know that Polensky was a bloomin' fool." "It comes to this 'ere," said one of the other men, stepping up close to me. "Do you know a jerry when you sees one? A red 'un, mind you." I had not the faintest idea what the man meant. I temporized. "I haven't seen one yet, you know." The fellow looked furtively at the door and then, diving into an inner pocket, pulled out a handsome gold watch with a massive chain attached, exhibited it for a moment, and then dropped it back. "That's the little article," he said, "and before you makes a bid, you can look it over and try if the stuff's genuine. But not out here, you know. We does our deal inside where you can't get oogled by a copper through the winder." I saw the plan at a glance, and in the main approved, though 3 at once was a bigger handful than I should have desired. They would require careful treatment. "I will just go and see that it's all clear," I said, and with this I retired to the parlour, quietly bolting the door behind me. Chapter 6